Our speaker this evening is well known to very many of you. He is currently in his second tour as the chairman of the Society. He is an accomplished battlefield guide, the very epitome of a modern Major General, because he's into all of the field sports, fly fishing, hunting, shooting, excuse me. He has been the High Sheriff of Wiltshire and is a fluent Gurkhali speaker, having served many times during his service with the Gurkhas. His talk this evening is on particular action in the Peninsular War, but to demonstrate how he believes that this was the coming of age for the modern infantry. Our speaker, as I said, is still currently the chairman of the Society, Ashley Truluck, and I'm going to put his slides up, and then I'm going to leave the stage, Ashley, and leave events to you. Are you happy for me to go?
Yes, indeed. Can you hear me?
We can.
Good. Okay, well, hello, everybody. It's great to be here. There is the race card. I'll give you a second just to have a quick glance at that first slide. So really just to lead off, a couple of years ago, I took an SAHR, Society of Army Historical Research, what my wife calls irreverently the Society of Army Hysterical Research. I took a group from the Society on one of my Peninsular War tours, and we chose as our theme the operations of Wellington's elite light division, which of course has been brought to life in the last couple of decades by Bernard Cornwell's Richard Sharp series. And we looked in particular at the 95th Rifles and the evolution of the rifle, as opposed to the musket. And of all the fascinating places and stories that we came across on that very enjoyable tour, none were more beautiful or remote or more historically significant or so well documented and yet virtually unknown to later visitors and historians than a little incident, not much more than a skirmish, that took place in a mountain gorge on the Spanish-Portuguese border below a remote village called Barba del Puerco, which translates from the Spanish as pig's beard. It took place in March 1810 in the Peninsular War. This was the place, I would put it to you, and the moment that the rifle and the new tactics that it initiated came of age in the British Army. The question is, did the Army recognize this as a strategic shift in 1810, and was it able to match this with a cultural shift in infantry equipment and tactics to capitalize on this? Well, to answer that question, we need to wind the clock back to the period leading up to the Napoleonic Wars, when the standard infantry weapon in all armies was, of course, the smoothbore musket, a weapon which had the enormous advantage of being cheap and cheerful. In other words, it could be mass-produced. It was simple to learn for the largely illiterate armies of the time. But it was no precision weapon. The lead shot it used was loose-fitting in the barrel, meaning that much of the explosive force behind the ball was lost in windage, and the projectile rattled erratically down the barrel, emerging at fairly random angles, thereby reducing both accuracy and range. And to overcome these disadvantages, muskets had to have long barrels, which meant that soldiers had to stand to load them and to stand firing in tightly packed straight lines, shoulder to shoulder, in order to send a mass of projectiles in the general direction of the enemy, really an area weapon, rather like a naval broadside. There was another very significant reason for such close order drills, and this is a point that's often underestimated or forgotten. private soldiers in those days could only shoot to kill on orders of an officer commissioned by the king to do so. Thus, all troops had to be close by and within earshot of a commissioned officer. Yet those same British officers and their landowner friends were well aware that there were handy short barrel weapons available with rifled grooves cut inside the barrel, which would reduce windage and impart spin to the projectile, thus increasing range and accuracy phenomenally. They used such weapons regularly on their country estates, shooting at wildfowl like snipe, hence the expression sniper, and they even took them with them for game shooting in the peninsula. So why were these weapons not adapted for military purposes? Well, the answer is they were expensive compared with the simple smoothbores. They took twice as long to load. They also took longer to learn how to fire it effectively, and that required soldiers who were sufficiently intelligent and literate, and also officers who could reliably delegate the decision to fire to those soldiers. And that was a big ask in those days. That didn't deter the more imaginative German and Austro-Hungarian armies, who recruited local hunters and foresters as skirmishers, maneuvering in open order, armed with their own rifles. As the British Army discovered to their cost in America, where rebel frontiersmen, with a natural feel for fieldcraft and concealment, and supplied with the German-manufactured Kentucky rifles, ran rings around British musketeers operating in rigid formation. Britain's response in 1755 was to recruit German mercenaries to serve in the newly formed 60th Royal American Regiment. But it wasn't until 1798 that its 5th Battalion became the first camouflage green jacketed rifle unit in the British Army. But back in England, this was just seen as a unique response to a remote threat. So much so that when Dundas wrote his famous drill manual just before the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars, only 7 of its 500 pages were devoted to light infantry tactics, and the musket and line culture was perpetuated. In contrast, the French could see the advantage of using skirmishers en masse, but even Napoleon drew the line at equipping his volatile conscripts with rifles. Wellington, on the other hand, was prepared to take that risk with his better trained and volunteer army, but only on an experimental basis initially. So it was that an ad hoc experimental rifle corps was set up at Shorncliffe, and was almost immediately dispatched to Ferrol in Spain in August 1800, still wearing the uniforms of their original regiments. And the subsequent story of Sir John Moore and his training of what became the famous Light Brigade and then the Light Division at Shorncliffe is so well known that I'll gloss over it very quickly. Suffice to say that the Experimental Rifle Corps evolved into Britain's first indigenous rifle regiment, which adopted the next line number, the 95th. The 95th Rifles' distinctive uniform was fashionably cut in light cavalry style, but in camouflage green with black buttons and accoutrements for camouflage. It was armed with a short-barreled and, for its age, the amazingly accurate Baker rifle, capable of hitting targets out to 800 yards and beyond. And to make up for the short barrel, it was issued with an extra long sword bayonet. The expression fixed swords is still used by the modern rifle regiment instead of fixed bayonets on parade. In short, they were the 19th century equivalent of today's special forces. And they had no problem recruiting. When they first went to recruit, they actually had 1,000 more people coming forward than they had places for, and formed actually 3 whole battalions as a result. They could therefore be highly selective, creaming off soldiers of higher intelligence and literacy, and selecting countrymen who could stalk an enemy as stealthily as they would a fox or a pheasant, but also with a smattering of skilled craftsmen from the new industrial cities in UK, blacksmiths, cobblers, tailors, and medical assistants, who could provide the necessary skills to enable rifle companies to operate independently. In the field, the rifle's combination of short barrel and long range meant that riflemen could fire from various positions and spread out to cover more ground, often out of sight and sound of their officers. And the rifle's only disadvantage, being its slower rate of fire, was overcome by the men operating in pairs, often one firing whilst the other loads, and these pairs arranged in two loose chains, each leapfrogging the other, whilst keeping a strong reserve behind who could deploy to one flank or the other to give covering fire if necessary, as we will see happened at Barba del Puerco. Most significantly, riflemen were allowed to use their own initiative to select their own targets, a concept which made traditional line officers feel distinctly uncomfortable, particularly the less popular ones, especially when riflemen started to snipe at officers at long range to take out enemy command and control, as exemplified by the famous rifleman Ned Plunkett's shot at Casabelos on the retreat to Corunna, where he took out not only a French general, but also his ADC at a range of excess of 600 yards. But note, this just reinforced the idea that the 95th were just a corps of individual snipers. They had yet to prove that they could fight as a formed unit. For that, they needed a forward-thinking and innovative champion, and the 95th found one in Black Bob Crauford. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was a scientific officer. As a young man, he travelled to Germany, where he studied languages, engineering and artillery, and gained a solid grasp of military history and strategy. But his experience on the continent had been largely in staff appointments, and when eventually given command of a light brigade in Buenos Aires expedition in 1807, he suffered the ignominy of having to surrender it when let down by his superiors. And when he subsequently commanded a light brigade on Moore's Spanish expedition later that year, he again missed out when his brigade was diverted to Vigo, whilst the rest of the army fought a successful final engagement at Corunna. And when given a third shot at brigade command on the Talavera campaign of 1809, he yet again missed out when his brigade arrived too late to share in Wellington's victory, despite what has gone down as the greatest forced march in British Army history. Thus, in 3 years and 3 brigade commandments, Crauford had failed to clock a single battlefield victory, and he enters the year of our story tonight, 1810, as arguably the most overqualified but under-promoted officer for his age. He has a huge chip on his shoulder and a great mountain to climb if he's finally to prove himself. Luckily, the one common denominator in his command experience to date is that all 3 campaigns he had had at least 1 battalion of the 95th Rifles under his command. And a very interesting dynamic develops between Crauford's so-called scientific approach to command and the Rifles' innovative approach to tactics. Look, for example, at Beadle's magnificent painting of the Light Brigade rearguard. There's the main body of Moore's army on the right, retreating towards Corunna, whilst a body of weary and dishevelled riflemen lean on their Baker rifles, looking up at Crauford in silent respect, as if trying to catch a nod or a sign of approval from what Rifleman Harris describes in his diary as the shepherd of our flock. Behind them, in red tunics, are the men of the 43rd and the 52nd Light Infantry, with whom the 95th are invariably brigaded. And alongside Crauford is his cavalry liaison officer, whose light cavalry regiment is posted out in front of the infantrymen, whilst behind the cavalry, Ross's horse artillery battery is taking up a fire position on the hill above. This combined arms force, light infantry, rifles, light cavalry, light artillery or horse artillery, is a combined arms force which requires a huge amount of coordination and discipline, and this is where Crauford excelled. With his working knowledge of the Prussian General Staff system, combined with his scientific approach to problem solving, Crauford developed the celebrated Light Brigade operational standing orders, governing all activity on the march, in camp, and on outpost duty. Orders were strict in the extreme and enforced by rigid discipline, something that didn't sit comfortably with the 95th's more relaxed concept of individual initiative and self-discipline. But they could see that in the long term, strict adherence to common SOPs saved time, saved effort, and saved lives. A note about sources. How do we know all this in such detail? Well, the 95th in rifles in particular is very rich in primary sources. By the sheer nature of their employment, riflemen had a grandstand view of almost every major engagement in the Peninsular War. There was a much higher proportion of thinking officers and intelligent, literate soldiers than in the line regiments, and diary writing became de rigueur. And furthermore, following the awful fate that befell many of their wives on the retreat to Corunna and Viga, the 95th chose not to take any wives with them as camp followers on their Peninsular campaign, which meant that a lot of the soldiers and officers were writing letters home, and this provides a further source of primary material, written in such minute detail that reading them now, over 200 years later, you can still virtually smell the sweat and the cordite, as the second half of this presentation, I hope, will demonstrate. We're also lucky to have the very talented contemporary artist Krista Hook there on the right, who's made a particular study of the rifles antecedents and is used by the modern regiments as their artist in residence. And I use a lot of her artwork tonight. Here's her summary map of the Peninsular campaign. And just to recap and get us to our start point, in the winter of 1808-1809, the 95th formed part of the rearguard for Moore's retreat to Corunna, there on the north coast. In the summer of 1809, having hastily reconstituted in Shorncliffe, they were sent to Portugal to join Wellington's Talavera expedition, I've already mentioned. And now, in the autumn and winter of 1809, with three French armies converging on Wellington, we find the 95th in that small box, the darker brown box on the slide there, covering the retreat of his army back to Portugal from east to west. Here in the border lands, the mountains between Spain and Portugal, Wellington needs time for the bulk of his army to rest and reorganize in central Portugal, whilst his chief engineer, Colonel Fletcher, constructs the lines of Torres Vedras north of Lisbon, and General Beresford trains up the Portuguese army, which eventually doubles the size of Wellington's army. So Wellington tasked Crauford to use his light brigade to provide a covering screen on the Spanish-Portuguese border, astride the traditional invasion route from Spain to Portugal, shown as the box there I mentioned. And this is where we find the 95th towards the end of 1809. So let's just zoom in on that box. There's the invasion route running from the right, from the east to the west, from Spain to Portugal. You can see that the mighty River Douro runs across the north of the slide there, and it has three tributaries running south. It's got running from east to west. We've got the River Agueda, which is bridged at Ciudad Rodrigo, where there is the Spanish fort, the key to Spain, guarding the entrance to Spain there. And a bit further north, in a very deep gorge, there's an old Roman bridge at a place called Barba del Puerco. I think you can see it there. Then in the center, you've got the Gurkhas stream, which runs between the two main rivers there. And you can see Fort Conception there, which is the fort which actually sits virtually on the border between Spain and Portugal. And finally, on the east, there is the fortress of Almeida, which is the Portuguese key to Spain, to Portugal, I beg your pardon, where there is another bridge there over the River Coa. That is the area of operations where we find the Light Division, or the Light Brigade as is at this stage. South of the road, that east-west road, we've got Mackinnon's Conventional Infantry Brigade guarding the open area, which doesn't really come into the story, so I'll just park them there. But north of the road, in the more mountainous country, we've got Crauford's Light Brigade. And it's a box which is framed by the River Douro to the north, the east-west invasion route in the south, the Coa in the west, and the Agueda in the east. An area which is 40 miles north to south and 25 miles east to west. That's a huge area for a small brigade to cover. And Wellington has ordered Crauford to act as the army's covering force, reporting on enemy deployments, the French, of course, coming from the east, from the right, while screening those of Wellington's main army over in Portugal. And if and when a French army advances in force, Crauford is to delay their progress, initially on the line of the Agueda, then the Gurkhas, and finally the Coa, without getting caught on the wrong side of them, and thereby hangs a story. To do this would require the most efficient observation and reporting system and perfect timing, as Crauford was forbidden to blow bridges behind him, as Wellington would require them the following summer for his anticipated advance into Spain. This was the role for which Crauford's scientific approach and standing orders were perfectly suited. So Crauford starts by setting up his headquarters at Fort Conception there, right on the border itself. Fort Conception has a very dramatic and large underground stables. So this is also the base from which his attached light cavalry and Royal Horse Artillery operate. And it becomes a very busy operational hub, as you can see. When we went there with the SAHR group, and I shall be there again in a month's time, we saw that it's now garrisoned by rather more attractive Portuguese troops. The fort is now used as a wedding and honeymoon centre, so it's rather fitting that it's called Fort Conception. As a first line of observation, Crauford had his King's German Legion Hussars, the best light cavalry in the Peninsular Army. They are deployed as a tripwire along the banks of the River Agueda. And Crauford often posted them personally and visited them, conversing in perfect German. And here is a good example of his scientific method in action. The Hussars are continuously monitoring water levels along the length of the Agueda so that they could accurately predict when and where the French were likely to become shallow enough for the French to ford. The second line of defense was the independent rifle companies of the 95th, distributed behind the Agueda in direct support of this German tripwire. Up here on the plateau was perfect light infantry company, plenty of rocks for protection and vegetation for concealment. The third line of defense was where Crauford then garrisoned the villages on the plateau with his two light infantry battalions, the 43rd and the 52nd. And finally, operating within that framework is his horse artillery battery, Ross's battery, in support and operating out of Fort Conception. But he was dangerously stretched and outnumbered, with fewer than 5,000 men to face what was becoming a French army of 57,000. And so he perfected a system of signalling so that any movements detected by the cavalry line of observation could be quickly communicated to their infantry supports and then back to the brigade reserve and artillery, who moved to pre-planned assembly points at a moment's notice. As Oman so eloquently put it, the whole spider's web of communication quivered at the slightest touch. And Napier reckoned that, given Crauford's standing orders, it took just 7 minutes for the brigade to get under arms and a quarter of an hour by night or day to bring it in order of battle to its alarm posts. The one place where on the whole 20-mile front that didn't fit into this neat rubric was here, where the red star is, where French troops from San Felices on the east bank of the Coa frequently infiltrated across the Roman bridge into the remote village of Barba del Puerco. And the problem was that at this point, the Agueda Gorge was so deep and so narrow that Crauford could not employ cavalry or artillery support. The only troops with the training and long-range weapons to plug this capability gap unsupported were the 95th Rifles. So when the French withdrew their latest infiltration into Barba del Puerco back to Seguro on the 12th of March, 1810, Colonel Sidney Beckwith, commanding officer of the 1st Battalion of the 95th Rifles, moved his battalion headquarters plus 4 weak rifle companies, 350 men altogether, to secure the village and the bridge below it. Now, Beckwith was the sort of officer that subalterns and soldiers idolized. He was a natural leader who understood soldiers and how to draw out the best in them. He set clear rules and expected them to be respected. And if they were, he cut his men a lot of slack by encouraging them to relax and engage in all manner of diversions: football, cockfighting, pig hunting when off duty. At Christmas, he even organized this greased pig race for the lads to catch for the pot. Most of all, he was possessed of unflappable courage and led by quiet example rather than by bullying and the whip. And in this respect, he was the opposite of Crauford. Down at the old Roman bridge, below the village, British and French day sentries came to a mutual arrangement in the time-honoured fashion of soldiers on outpost duty, whilst local girls lost no opportunity to sell liquor to the Brits or renew relations with former French paramours. And on the 19th of March, it was number 3 company's turn to be the duty company, under the command of Captain Peter O'Hara. And if Bernard Cornwall ever had a role model for Richard Sharp, this must be him. According to Costello, he was a man whose eccentric habits were equalled only by his ugly countenance, but popular with the ladies and as brave as a lion. A tough Irish adventurer who had risen from the ranks. He was one of the original men who joined the Experimental Corps in 1800 and took command of 3 Company when the 95th were formed in 1803. And he'd been on continuous operational service, which meant that now, 7 years later, he is the senior captain in the regiment and sweating on promotion to major. But is becoming frustrated that he's starting to be overtaken for promotion by those officers with money and privilege. And after 7 years of campaigning, his company is down to 50% strength, with his men normally organized into 2 platoons, as we would call them today. He had 3 company officers, all very young. Lieutenant Mercer, a bespectacled platoon commander who also acted as company second in command. Lieutenant Cohn was the the 2nd Platoon Commander. Both Mercer and Cone had seen operational service, as had their platoon sergeants, Fairfoot and Betts. And then there was 2nd Lieutenant John Simmons, one of my favourites. He, on the other hand, had not yet been bloodied and was kept under the robust instruction by O'Hara. Simmons was a well-read chaplain's son from a large and close-knit family with whom he corresponded weekly and candidly. And he's a particularly rich and reliable primary source of information. Other dramatis personae we'll meet this evening will be the battalion adjutant, Stewart, and bugler Green, who are both diarists and up at battalion headquarters with Beckwith in the village. And at the other end of the scale are privates Mayer and McCann, who are due to be on sentry duty on the bridge tonight. So let's take a virtual battlefield tour of the ground. Here we are. There's Barba del Puerco, bottom left-hand corner. You've got then going right from there the bridge, which is in the gorge of the river Agueda, which forms the border between Portugal and Spain. And then 2 miles along the trail there is San Felices, where we find the French force. Distance between the two, about 2.5 or 3 miles, but a very steep drop down into the river and back up again the other side. If you just take a close-up of the bridge at Barba del Puerco itself, there we go. You can see the track zigzagging down to the bridge and zigzagging up again the other side, which is an indication of how steep it is. And in the village, you have the battalion headquarters with sentries on the outskirts of the village and guarding the battalion headquarters itself, which is in the tavern in the village, which is still there and still owned by the same family that were there at the time. And then down guarding the bridge are the sentries who trigger the alarm if it was threatened. And for this reason, the duty company keeps the balance of its company up at a picket house overlooking the canyon, ready to deploy as and when required. If we look at that picket house in more detail, again, it's still there very satisfyingly. There it is. It's the old Roman Catholic chapel, and still is, which was requisitioned much to the annoyance of the Roman Catholic Church. The building acted as the company ops room, the duty company ops room, and was the base for the company reserve, whose men were allowed to sleep in the chapel, provided they did so in full kit with their rifles to hand, whilst the officers were in bivouacs in the garden outside, just off the right beyond the wall of the photograph. And if we now start walking from that picket house down towards the bridge, a further 100 yards on from the village, you get your first view of the gorge, a magnificent sight. And I don't mean me, I mean the gorge. We always like to arrive here, I always like to arrive here as early as possible, just as the sun is beginning to reach into the gorge and the mountain eagles start flying from their nests up, spiraling up on thermals, providing a magnificent sight as you're trying to tell the story. And if we take, this is really just the first sight of the gorge, just 100 yards from the picket post. If we go a further 200 yards on and 200 feet down, we get to the battalion RV, where according to the well-practiced standing orders, the oncoming and outgoing duty officers would meet when visiting the bridge. This is where the duty company's quick reaction force would initially assemble if called out, and where the battalion command post would be established in the event of a major and significant attack on the bridge. And you can see marked there a track going down to the bridge. And I mentioned the Spanish spur, you can see it marked there, which I'll come back to in a moment. Let's go another 200 yards on and a further 300 feet down. And we reach a rocky outcrop. Remember that rock. This is where O'Hara posts a half platoon of 12 men under the experienced Sergeant Tuttle Betts. It's just 50 yards from the bridge and some 100 yards above it. And let's go down to the bridge now, but just have a quick look at the satellite map there. You can see just off the picture top is the picket house. You can then see the RV, then you've got the forward picket post. And now down here, we are at the bridge itself, and this is where the sentries were. This particular photograph was taken on one of my many trips with battalions of the modern rifles. These are all officers and sergeants of the 5th Battalion of the Rifles. And it's great to take the modern soldiers on this trip to see their heritage. This is where the 2 sentries, Mayer and McCann, were posted, exactly where these guys are standing now. You can see the bridge, the Roman bridge there. You can note the width of it, about 12 feet, and its length. And you can see that there is an old customs post overlooking it on the French side, on the Portuguese side, I beg your pardon, on the Spanish side. And that was the old customs house, which signifies the fact that this was the original route into Portugal. The almost impassable section of the river downstream from the bridge was watched over by a company of Spanish infantry, and their closest picket post was on the spur just above it, shown in yellow there, overlooking the bridge, where a side path led back up to the river. The duty company was responsible for attaching a corporal and several riflemen to this Spanish picket to act as a liaison point. And deployments were carried out in darkness and recovered before dawn each morning, the exact locations varying each night to keep the French guessing. So imagine now it's the evening of the 19th of March. The sun went down at 6:30, and O'Hara has just posted his men in the dark, as I've described. The French sentries have been withdrawn from the customs house opposite and repositioned on the spur above. O'Hara takes his tenderfoot Simmons and orders him to crawl across the bridge in the fading light to conduct a reconnaissance of the customs house in case the French have left any documents which would provide useful intelligence. In fact, I guess it was really a bit of a trade test for young Simmons, just to test his nerve. O'Hara and Simmons then return up the track to the chapel, where O'Hara, on the excuse of saying the feelings unwell, takes to his bed in the village and leaves Simmons to retire to his tent beside the chapel. Mercer, as the senior subaltern, is left in temporary command of the company, and meanwhile the rest of the battalion are settling down for the night, with Private Green being posted outside where Colonel Beckwith and the adjutant Stewart's quarters are in the tavern. Lieutenants Mercer and Cohn take turns to visit Sergeant Betts at the forward picket, meeting at the RV en route, while Simmons remains with the men and the quick reaction force at the chapel. Elsewhere along the river, Harry Smith is posting troopers of the 16th Light Dragoons, who will be on duty tonight, mounting the sentries or vedettes at potential fording points along the river. Although it's been raining all day and the river is high, so there's few fording points to monitor. Meanwhile, out of eye and earshot on the other side of the river, the French garrison at San Felices is silently standing too. Their commander is General Claude Francois Ferret, a hardened campaigner of the old Imperial Army who survived the revolution and is rising again from the ranks to become a brigade commander on the strength of his performance at some of Napoleon's largest batteries. Ferret has received orders to disperse the enemy's advance post on the Agueda and to push as far as the Portuguese fortress at Almeida in order to ascertain the strength, readiness, and intentions of the British Army across the river. So he prepares to conduct a reconnaissance in force. About half of the total garrison at San Felices, who all volunteers or selected men, were therefore being assembled in the town square, some 3 miles from the bridge. They move out at 11 p.m. to negotiate the winding dirt track down to the bridge. It's a filthy night, cold with driving rain, very slippery as they descend. Tucked on his rocky outcrop, bottom right in the picture there, above the bridge, obviously this picture taken in daylight instead of dark, is Sergeant Betts and his 12 riflemen, unaware that Ferry's men are approaching and fanning out into 2 groups. Ferry's plan shown in blue there, is that his assault group of 600 men from the Brigade's light and grenadier companies will rush the bridge silently, capture and disarm the sentries, and then take out Sergeant Bett's forward picket, preferably by enveloping it silently, but if not, by direct assault, covered by fire from a support group on the spur above. And once the assault group has secured the bridgehead on the British side, most of the support group will then move rapidly across the bridge, up the path, to catch the remainder of the British in their beds in the village. Now, in what was one of the greatest feats of sound and light discipline in the history of the Napoleonic warfare, the French assault group made it to their forming up point behind the custom house completely undetected. Down in the gorge, and this is a view from the British sentry post, down in the gorge, huddled together in their raincoats against the sleet and the cold, the two British sentries don't see anything or hear anything due to the thunderous noise of the swollen river, nor do they detect the assault group forming up in dead ground behind the customs house less than 150 yards away. The stage is now set for a contest between two elites, Foray's hand-picked grenadiers and skirmishers versus Beckwith's well-drilled riflemen. But it's not a fair fight. Foray has 1,500 men to O'Hara's 75, an initial attack ratio of 25-1, which could reduce to 5-1 if Beckwith can mobilize the rest of his battalion quick enough, but that's still formidable odds. The first moment the British sentries become aware that something is up is when Foray's assault group rushed the bridge in massive force. Thereafter, the rifles' SOPs click in. The sentries manage to get a warning shot off before both sentries are wounded and captured and bundled off to the French rear for questioning, in what is clearly a very well-planned professional operation by the French. At the forward picket, Sergeant Betts has been alerted by the firing, stands his men to, and within seconds, French grenadiers are swarming up the rocks towards him. At the top of the hill, Lieutenant Mercer hears the firing and orders Second Lieutenant Simmons to form up the quick reaction force at the chapel, and dispatches Lieutenant Cone to fetch O'Hara and alert the adjutant. See the SOBs clicking in here. And then he runs down the hill to assess the situation, only to find that Sergeant Betts has had his jaw shot away and the platoon position is about to be overrun. He takes command. Meanwhile, Simmons has mustered the men at the chapel and has led them down to reinforce Mercer and Betts at the forward picket here. Among them was Private Costello, who records, "In less than a minute, we were all under arms. I've never been under fire of a French musket, and I felt an indescribable thrill on this occasion. The chill of the night and the particular inclination to sleep at the time had sunk my senses low, but I was speedily started out of my lethargy by the whizzing of the enemy's bullets as they greeted my astonished hearing. My surprise soon, however, gave place to perfect recollection." Young Lieutenant Simmons hadn't been under fire either, so it was with great trepidation that he led his men down the steep slope to the forward picket. He writes in his diary, "We were soon met by men with the impression that the French were passing the bridge in great force. We doubled forward and found the French forming up in line with drums beating and officers yelling furiously. Whereas the French fired volley after volley, the balls mainly passed over our heads. Our standing orders were not to fire at night until men came within 15 yards and we had a firm target to fire at. By this time, I was up with Lieutenant Mercer and saw him trying to put his glasses on. And on seeing me, he shouted, 'Our brave men are fighting like true Britons.' But at that moment, an unlucky ball passed through poor Mercer's head and he fell at my feet, quite dead." Mercer was a popular officer and his men temporarily lost their cool. Simmons explains, "An enraged rifleman broke cover right, crying, 'Revenge the death of Mr. Mercer!' And he charges down the slope at the French officer leading the assault, swings his rifle into his face and blows his head off at point-blank range. The French, in turn, are outraged, and within seconds, the rifleman is riddled with bullets. Here's Simmons again. By this time, the enemy was surrounding us in every direction. For a moment, time stood still, and every rifleman's eyes were upon me, looking for my next move. The fact is, of course, that with Mercer dead and Lieutenant Coates still searching for Captain O'Hara in the village, Second Lieutenant Simmons realizes that in this, his first engagement, he's now temporarily in command of 3 company, and thus is effectively the vanguard of the whole British Army. But the adrenaline pumps, the training clicks in, the SOPs apply, and drawing on his inspiration from Beckwith's cool example, he calmly takes responsibility. Meanwhile, to their right, the Spanish soldiers on the spur desert their posts, leaving the British corporal and his small liaison detachment to fight on alone. All hell now breaks loose, with men on both sides priming and firing as fast as they can. Everyone's blood was up. Simmons continues in his diary. The French were literally scrambling up the rocky ground within 10 yards of us. We commenced firing, aimed shots, whilst they attempted to form line and return fire. Their drummers beat the pas de charge, and the French officers attempted to dislodge us without effect. Several of their soldiers were now falling. Several of ours were now falling, but by Providence was with us, as the moon now came out from behind the clouds and shone brightly for a few minutes. We profited by these circumstances, as the French crossbows belts were white and over their greatcoats, which gave us a grand aiming mark for our rifles. Meanwhile, our men, being in dark uniforms and dispersed amongst the rocks, made very difficult targets for them. But just then, to Simmons' intense relief, Captain O'Hara at last appears on the scene. And conscious that he needs to assert himself quickly, he bellows out so everyone knows he's there and back in command. "We shall never retire. Here we will stand. They shall not pass unless over my dead body." And Simmons adds, "The shots were now flying around us, thick as hailstones, and the French were advancing upon us, but we kept up a terrible, disciplined, aimed fire. I saw French officers beating the men with their swords to make them try and drive us from the rocks that we occupied, and several letting their muskets fall and clapping their hands upon their bodies when they received a wound they know not where from and went scampering away." Back in the village, Bugler Green sounds the assembly, and the remaining 3 companies gather at their respective assembly points. Trading speed for smartness, they arrived at their various states of dress and undress, but every man is carrying his Baker rifle and 60 rounds of ammunition. And as soon as Lieutenant Cone had reported the situation to him, the adjutant led the 3 companies of the battalion to the battalion RV overlooking the gorge. Here, Beckwith conducted a snap battle appreciation. He calmly sent 1 company off to occupy the spur overlooking the right flank, which he correctly guessed had been abandoned by the Spanish, and from here they could provide covering fire for the other 2 companies, which Beckwith now led down the hill, meeting O'Hara conducting a fighting withdrawal coming back up it. Here's Simmons again. Our little company had been fighting, holding off 600 Frenchmen for at least half an hour, when the colonel and the 3 other companies coming to our assistance. The pleasantest sight I ever beheld, and we set up a most furious hurrah. This was hand-to-hand fighting, which had no respect, as Costello records. He says, despite the extra 3 companies, the contest for a while was both doubtful and bloody. During this brief conflict, I saw Colonel Beckwith himself heaving large fragments of rock upon the enemy as he attempted to ascend the acclivity on which we were placed. Meanwhile, our adjutant, Lieutenant Stewart, a fine tall fellow, was engaged in a personal contest with 2 or 3 grenadiers, a number of whom had managed to ascend the hill to our right where the Spaniards had been. At this critical moment, one of our riflemen came up to his aid and shot one of the assailants, to which the others instantly surrendered. Beckwith, meanwhile, with his extensive experience, saw the telltale signs that the French attack was faltering. the slower rate of fire, soldiers going to ground, officers going manic, beating the backs of the soldiers to get them moving. This was the operational tipping point, so important for commanders to recognize, and it had arrived. Beckwith issues orders for the counterattack. Here's Simmons again. He says, our companies fixed swords and came on like lions, the colonel at their head, the French scampering off in the greatest dismay, throwing down their arms and running down the precipice, carrying off their killed and wounded, as they generally endeavour to do, in order that the number they lose could not be as well ascertained by their enemies. The French, unlike us, had fired very high throughout the engagement. Otherwise, from their great superiority, they would have destroyed every man of our company before the other three came to our assistance. Less than an hour after the first shot, the British had rounded up those who had not escaped back over the bridge. And Simmons records that a young Frenchman was taken and he fired into Colonel Beckwith's face. The bullet was deflected by the colonel's cap beak and glazed the top of his head. A rifleman was just going to blow the boy's brains out when the colonel stopped him, saying calmly, let the lad alone. I dare say the boy has a mother. Knock the thing out of his hand that he may do no more mischief, and give him a kick on the bottom and send him to the rear. Interestingly enough, Simmons then records, the next morning the boy was given a hearty breakfast at the colonel's table at the tavern. And on being questioned about firing so wantonly, he said he was in such agitation that he was not aware that his finger was on the trigger. Now, this morning invitation was actually a very subtle field interrogation, conducted in the most gentlemanly fashion, at which the unsuspecting young lad, Frenchman, gave up much useful intelligence. Reflecting on his actions that night, Simmons writes, quote, the night gave me a good opinion of myself. I fought alone for some time with fearful odds, my friend dead at my feet. After this night, I was considered a soldier fit to face the devil. I consider myself very lucky in not receiving a scratch, being exposed so long to the enemy's fire. I now know what it's like to meet the enemy in the field, and I'm confident that I shall always do my duty. My captain was pleased to say that my conduct had given him the greatest satisfaction. Meanwhile, that Captain O'Hara, the old rogue, despite not being in his proper post initially, gets away with it and lives to fight another day. Whilst Beckford could similarly reflect on the evening with great satisfaction that this had been the perfect testbed for his battalion. A brigade of elite French troops, armed with muskets, making a surprise attack with massive superiority on a half battalion of British riflemen without their normal brigade support. On the one hand, he had seen that the French were well led and well drilled as ever, that as soon as they came across the bridge and surprise was lost, their instinct was to deploy into line in order to stand and fire for maximum effect. And the soldiers had to await orders from the officers before advancing, and in so doing, revealed their presence and made highly visible targets. And that when they did fire, their shooting was erratic and the balls went high and wide. And that the fire from the support group on the spur, armed with muskets as they were too far away to deliver effective fire. On the other hand, the British riflemen had remained in cover, in camouflage uniforms, firing from prone positions, and not exposed themselves to targets. Soldiers followed their standing orders, fired on their own initiatives without waiting for orders. They observed strict fire discipline to maximize lethality and minimize ammunition expenditure, making every shot count. And the battalion reserve mobilized in minutes, rapidly reducing the initial French attack ratio from 25-1 down to 5-1. And they equally rapidly occupied the ridge abandoned by the Spaniards and were able to give covering fire from there. Wellington, not a man to give praise lightly, congratulated Crauford, and Crauford relayed his congratulations with this telling message to Beckwith. I'll give you a moment just to read it. Key words. The action reflects honour on Lieutenant Colonel Beckwith and the regiment, inasmuch that it was of the sort that riflemen of other armies would shun. In other armies, the rifle is considered ill-calculated for close action with an enemy armed with a musket and bayonet. But the 95th has proved that the rifle in the hands of a British soldier is a fully efficient weapon to enable him to defeat the French in the closest fight. Crauford's scientific system had been vindicated. His standing orders, his command and control arrangements, his communication and early warning system had all worked perfectly. And Wellington acknowledges this by putting the Light Brigade's supporting artillery and cavalry elements under Crauford's direct command and allocating him 2 newly trained Portuguese light infantry battalions, thereby allowing his infantry brigade to expand into what was the first independent all-arms division in the British Army. That division, the Light Division, famously goes on to fight for the rest of the Peninsular War, with battalions of the 95th formed up as units in its core. Here they are at Crauford's famous fighting withdrawal at Pontus de Nora, where I shall be in about 4 weeks' time. And you can see there, middle left, the 95th Rifles, actually as a mobile square as they withdraw, with French heavy cavalry swarming around them. In the middle distance, top right, is the 43rd Light Infantry, also in square temporarily. Beyond them, at the top of the slide, is Crauford's brigade headquarters or division headquarters, and to their left, top left of the slide, is the 52nd, ready to march on. And milling in between them, you can just see them in front of the division headquarters is Ross's light artillery battery, horse artillery battery. And of course, many of these same people that you met tonight reappear at Waterloo, where the 1st Battalion of the 95th get to hold the vital sandpit at Wellington's crossroads, and another as part of Adams' Light Brigade, which makes the decisive flank attack on the French Imperial Guard. But Waterloo heralds 50 years of peace, and with it complacency and cuts, as the government reaps the peace dividend. So although Crauford's revolutionary concept of standing orders, or SOPs, becomes standard practice across the army, the money and imagination required to adopt the rifle and rifle tactics fully as the new norm was not forthcoming, to the extent that 50 years later, in the Crimea, the British Army is still generally employing musket and line tactics. And it wasn't until the mass-produced breech-loading rifles such as the Martini Henry become available that the British Army was at last reaping the full lessons of Barba del Puerco. And of course, modern infantry operates on those principles. And so the rifle ethos lived on as this splendidly relaxed rifle brigade statue at Winchester, which became the base of the Light Division and Peninsula Barracks, exemplifies. And it still does. The famous light regiments that fought in the Peninsula, the 43rd, the 52nd, the 60th, and the 95th, amalgamated to form the Green Jackets in 1966, and the remaining county light infantry regiments were amalgamated to form the light infantry in 68. And finally, these all came together as the modern Rifles Regiment of 5 battalions in 2007, with whom I have enjoyed many a happy battlefield tour over the hills and far away, to quote the regimental march in Belgium, France, Portugal, and Spain. And there I will leave the story and hand back to Duncan for the Q&A session. I hope you enjoyed the ride.
I was interested by one of your initial comments, which was that British soldiers were not allowed to fire without the authority of an officer, and therefore needed to be within hailing distance. Was that actually a legal requirement? And if so, how did the rifles circumvent that?
I'm not sure the extent to which it was a legal requirement. I believe the word commissioned officer means you are commissioned in order to have the right to take life. The fact is that even were it not, when you run with a musket, you've got to control the fire, so you fire in volleys, and that requires somebody to give an order, and it requires everybody to be close together. The rifles overcame that simply out of necessity, and it was made possible because A, they were volunteers, B, they were all picked men, and more intelligent than the norm.
Magnus it's more of an observation, I think, than a question, but I'll put it up. He says, Le Couture of the 104th describes troops being trained to load muskets lying down. Of course, you were saying that they needed to be standing in order to load.
Yes, I mean, you could physically manage it, but it would be very awkward. Just imagine you've got a musket which is almost 6 foot long. You're going to have to crawl along the length of the musket. I mean, the only practical way to do it quickly is to stand. Not a problem you have with a Baker rifle, of course, which is half the length, and so you could easily get to the end of the rifle barrel without having to stand up.
Justin's asked the question that as a battlefield guide I hate, because it's statistics, damn lies, etc. But
Butcher's bill, is it?
Yeah. How many casualties were there in this action?
The reason you hate it is the same reason I hate it, because what do you count? Do you count people who are wounded but die later, the next day, or a few hours later, or a week later? Or do you count the prisoners? If you do count the prisoners, do you uncount them when they come back? The actual butcher's bill, for what it's worth, as recorded by both sides, is, I'll just look it up for you now. I won't be a second. I've got it here somewhere. It's surprisingly few. Just bear with me 1 second. Yeah. The rifles recorded, and we can judge this as accurate because they had to send a return in. 1 officer and 8 men killed, 15 wounded, and 2 prisoners. The 2, of course, being the two sentries. The French, whose statistics are notoriously unreliable because no French commander wants to tell Napoleon he's taken a lot of casualties, they nevertheless reported 12 killed, 13 wounded in Ferry's dispatch. I think you can multiply that by at least 2, if not 3.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I hate it, that question, is because as the victor, you always want to amplify your success. As the loser, you want to minimize your loss, don't you? And of course, it is how good is your bureaucracy at the end of the day in terms of recording. Marcus has posed this question. Beckworth, rather than Crauford, was surely the hero of the hour. He organized the counterattack and he led the interrogation the following day. A useful man.
A very good question. I think I would answer that by saying that Crauford was the strategist and Beckworth was the tactician. I mean, Beckworth was operating within a brilliant framework of early warning system and support system. But yes, the man on the ground was Beckworth. Of course, Crauford took the credit, but but yes, Beckworth is the man. And Beckworth appears again in history several times leading up to Waterloo and beyond.
Yeah. Marcus knows that you've answered this question, but I'd like to amplify, if I may. What part, if any, did the Spanish infantry play? You've said that they abandoned their post. How reliable were they as allies at this stage?
The Spanish army, very unreliable. But Spanish guerrillas operating, and the word guerrilla starts in the Peninsula or with the Spanish guerrillas, were very effective indeed in harassing the French lines of communication. So really the heroes on the Spanish side are more the guerrillas. The Spanish army doesn't really become effective until begrudgingly they come under Wellington's command later in the Peninsula War, where he gets a degree of control over them. But quite frankly, they're more trouble than they're worth. I hope there's no Spaniards in the audience.
Mark has posed this question. How do you think, or sorry, do you think there was any link between Howe and Cornwallis's light infantry training pre-1776 and the use of light infantry battalions and the 33rd from 1779 in the American War of Independence and the later rifle training that you have described this evening?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Are we saying, was the experience in America translated into what happened in the Peninsula? Is that what we're talking about?
I think that is the nub of it.
Yeah, well, that's again, very good question. It was not only translated, it was actually imported, because the American regiment, the 60th, who styled themselves on the American frontiersmen, who themselves employed Hessians and other Germans. They used German mercenaries in the 60th, and the 60th came across the peninsula, and they were divided up, one company per brigade through Wellington's army, acting as true skirmishers. They never fought as a complete battalion like the 95th. And so all the experience they'd gained by effectively mimicking what the Americans were doing to us in America came across with the 60th. And all that experience was studied at Shorncliffe and taken note of. But of course, it was only really at the Shorncliffe elite that got it. The rest of the army didn't.
Okay, let's just expand on that slightly, in that you likened the light infantry of this time as the Army Special Forces. And of course, the ordinary soldier quite often despises the Special Forces because they get all the glory, etc. So what was the attitude of a line regiment to a rifleman?
Lots of good questions tonight. I think if I draw the analogy with the Imperial Guard, I mean, the Imperial Guard were haughty, they considered themselves above everything, and the rest of the French army hated them. They got all the perks and all the rest of it. It was different in the British Army. The rifles were considered to be a bit quirky, a bit, they were right up to halfway through the Peninsular War. The line regiments weren't quite sure they were really going to become anything special. They actually earned their spurs as time went on, starting with Barba del Puerco, and they earned the respect of the rest of the army. The nice thing about the rifles is they were, unlike, for example, the Imperial Guard, they were understated. They didn't make a big, like the SAS, they didn't make a big song and dance of it. They just got on with it. And they saved the bacon of the line regiments time and time again as acting as their screen force, the covering force, or the rear guard. So it was a quite different sort of relationship. I don't think there was any animosity at all. Nothing significant anyway.
Thank you. I know that you covered it in the talk, but the question has been asked, so let's just put it up again. You described it as a reconnaissance in force, but would you like to expand a bit about what the French were trying to achieve at about this time?
They had advanced to the border, and their next move when spring came would be to then invade Portugal and go for Lisbon. Hence, Fletcher is building the lines of Torres Vedras north of Lisbon. They know that there are forces along the border, but they don't know how many. So Ferré, who was a very fine guy, who you meet again at the rear guard at Salamanca, for example, Ferré is given the task to do a reconnaissance of force, the nature of which is you carry out a reconnaissance, and if you meet success, you keep reinforcing success. So had it all gone well, had he captured the bridge, got a bridgehead, then captured the village, he would have gone on to capture Almeida. And if that was going to work, perhaps just call that a day. And in the course of doing that, he would know exactly what there is along the border. And of course, only a few months later, we get the famous action on the Coa when the French again meet the 95th. And the 95th are almost caught the wrong side of the River Coa.
This is purely of interest to me, I suppose, but perhaps to many people. You now are a frequent visitor to that battlefield. How is it remembered in that particular area? Is it something that they're very familiar with, very proud of, or something they've never heard of?
When I went there once, I visited the tavern. I had a bit of time. I was with the 3rd Rifles, and I spoke to the tavern owner, and he very proudly took me into a back room, and he showed me a box he had with buttons, black buttons with 95 on them, which had come down through generations of his family there. So they know the story. The village itself, until a few years ago, was exactly as it was in the picture I showed you, Krista Hook's picture. It's now becoming a bit of a des-res. There's the odd, homes are being bought up by weekenders. Because the estate owners have changed its name from Pig's Beard, Barba del Puerco, to Porto Seguro, which sounds much posher. And I think in about 20 years' time, you'll see that it's a nice mountain resort. But just for the time being, it's still unspoilt, and the locals are very proud of their history there.
And that bridge?
The bridge is absolutely as it was then, and the route down to it and up the side is part of a cycle and trekking route in that part of Spain and Portugal.
Great. Actually, we've run out of questions now, but as I said in the comments, it's been well appreciated. It's well worth waiting for. I've been looking forward to the talk this evening for some time. As always, whenever I hear anything about the peninsula, that's the next place I want to go to. It's not something that I guide, actually. It's something I wish I had picked up 20 odd years ago. It's probably a bit too late in the day for me.
I don't know, I'll send you an invitation.
But on behalf of the Society and the audience this evening, and those that are watching the recording in the coming days, we'd like to thank you very much indeed for delivering that talk this evening. And just a reminder to everybody that our next talk is on the 2nd of April. You've seen the registration link there. It will be sent out in the normal way. And I look forward to seeing everybody in a few weeks' time. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.